Days, what are we going to talk about? How can we find inspiration? So I've had 2 days to think about it. And with your permission, what I'd like to do is something I've wanted to do for a very, very long time. I want to explore this prayer called the Amidah. And I want to try and find and understand the inspiration that lies within it. And so we're going to take it just little by little and unpack it and see where that takes us to in terms of enhancing our own sense of prayer, of inspiration when we stand up and we recite the Amidah. If we'll try that for a few days, and I'll get some feedback from you as to whether you find it helpful, useful, or not. But let's start today. So the first thing I want to say about it is something which strikes me many, many times when I stand up to daven the Amidah, is that I have got no clue whatsoever what I'm doing. I don't mean technically. But the very idea that you're standing over there, speaking aloud in a room by yourself, standing in front of a wall, I mean, it's just completely bizarre, isn't it? I mean, who are you talking to? And how do you know that you're being heard? Hello, is anyone listening? You know, it says there's a story I heard many years ago about the fellow who falls off a cliff and is hanging on by just a sort of little root of a branch, you know, and there's this precipice down below him, you know, he's going to fall to his death. And he's never really been a believer. And he looks up and he calls out, he says, if there's anybody up over there, he said, could you please answer me? Now's the time to declare yourself. And he hears a voice. He says, I'm here, my son. He says, oh, thank God, I found you. He says, what shall I do? He says, look, the voice says, just let go. It's going to be okay. You know, you're going to fall, you know, several thousand feet, maybe half a mile or so, but it's okay. You're going to live when you hit the bottom. And the guy looks down and he just sees this great void. And he looks up to heaven and says, is there anybody else there? Someone else, please. Maybe somebody with a better suggestion. You know, it's a very strange thing when you stand there and you're saying these words, and it requires an enormous amount of I mean, it's just a sense of belief inside of us that makes us feel that even if we're whispering or that our thoughts can be understood, it's a moment where every single day you actually have to encounter this concept of, do I believe? Yeah. Is this real? Is this just habit? You know, but I suppose as you take those 3 steps forward, once again, one has to, these are the thoughts which have to be in one's mind. It's a moment when you once again confront the concept of a God who you can't see, who's all-knowing, all-hearing, omniscient, who's somewhere inside of you, etc. And that's a massive, massive leap of faith. So I want to give just a little bit of background today to this prayer, which the Ashkenazim called the Shmoneh Esrei, the 18 prayer blessing, although it has 19 blessings these days, and which the Sfardim called the Amidah, the standing prayer. And we use both of these terms interchangeably these days. So the first thing is that there are many allusions to the fact that this is, and by the way, just to say this, that throughout the Talmud, when the word tefillah, prayer, is mentioned, they mean the Amidah. The Amidah is the core of prayer. Everything else around it is just a kind of surround sound to build up to the moment when you stand in front of the Almighty and you present yourself to Him and you utter these words of these blessings. All the previous part of it is intended to prepare us for it, to get us in a state where we can actually stand there and say these words in a meaningful way. So it is the core of prayer. So there are some very, very ancient sources which want to suggest that these prayers, this tefillah, these 18 blessings have actually been around for Jews for a very, very, very long time. So there are suggestions, for example, that Hannah's prayer, remember Hannah comes to pray for a child, and it's Shiloh. It's long before even the first temple. It's just after the Jews have entered the land. And there are ancient midrashim which show that in her prayer, Hannah's prayer, there's a reference to each one of these 18 blessings. There are other midrashim that suggest that these prayers actually were formulated at times of specific events. So that, for example, and they go through all of the 18 blessings, that when Abraham is saved in Ur Kasdim, back in the Mesopotamia, the place where he comes, and he is saved, from these forces around him, from Nimrod and the others, when he breaks his father's idols, and they want to put him to death for this heresy. The angels shout out when he is saved, Magen Avraham, the shield of Abraham. Then when Isaac survives the business of the Akedah, the angels call out Mechayeh HaMeitim, the one who revives the dead. So here the suggestions are that we're going right back to the very earliest moments when there's something in these words over here that become core to the whole Jewish psyche and to the Jewish experience. We then find that the men of the Great Assembly, that is at the beginning of the Second Temple, there are 120 men of the Great Assembly formulated these 18 prayers. They weren't allowed to be written down at that stage, but these 18 prayers are formulated in a particular order, etc. It's not communal prayer yet. Not everybody is praying them. Certain individuals might be praying them, but they're already there at that point. And then we come to the Talmud, which of course is having a discussion in Yavne after the destruction of the temple. And we find there a discussion in which Rabbi Shimon HaPekuli, Rabbi Shimon the cotton picker, comes before the head of the Sanhedrin, who's Rabban Gamliel, and wants to put before him the order of the 18 blessings. And the Talmud asks the question, but why are they formulating these 18 blessings now? Surely they were formulated so much earlier, the time of the first temple with the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. And the suggestion that is given in the Talmud is that actually through all of the turmoils of the last 200 years of the temple, of the second temple, when wheels were falling off altogether, the blessings actually got lost. And when Shimon HaPekuli stands before Rabban Gamliel in Yavne, when they are reconstituting Judaism, setting the prayers for following generations, they actually have to come back and put it all together again. And that is when we actually see the real formulation of these prayers. And the Gemara in Megillah 13a, 13b, 14a, 14b goes through the whole of the Amidah and explains why the order of it and the details of it, etc., etc. So I don't want to go too much into the technicalities of it because we're looking for inspiration here. I want instead to in a more general term, to try and find some nuggets that lie in these prayers. So I think one of the first things I wanted to say today is, given this background, that as one steps up, they take those 3 steps forward to stand in God's presence, to recite these words, one needs to understand that we are saying words that have been recited by Jews for many, many thousands of years. And that we are just mouthing, we are little human beings in this generation expressing words that our ancestors have spoken as well, generation upon generation. Yes, of course, there are some small variations between the words between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and even between Ashkenazim, etc. But then in essence, the main body of these words, the order of them, the 18 blessings, etc., are very, very ancient, and they are actually something of a kind of a formula. They're a formula to unlock the way in which a Jew connects with our archetypal God. When I say archetypal God, there's only one God, but each nation has their own pathway to that God. They have an archetype, a format, a structure, a framework that is a channel through which one reaches that God. And this is actually our channel. These words every single one of them, as we'll see, is drawn from deeply, deeply within Judaic sources. So they become actually part of our identity. These words become our friends. Their familiarity, the way in which, the ease with which we say them, the underlying concepts of there are actually embedded in our soul. And therefore they become a conduit, they become a channel, a pipeline through which we allow our souls, our deepest sense of connectedness with God to express itself in the Amidah. And with that introduction, tomorrow, we're going to look at the little phrase with which we start the Amidah, which isn't even one of the blessings, and it was very contentious in Talmudic times. Hashem sefatai tiftach ufi agid tilatecha. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall declare your praise. We want to take a look at that and see why was that introduced, and what does it mean? But for that, I'm afraid we're going to have to gather again tomorrow. We find ourselves in Yavne. Yavne is now the center of Jewish life following the destruction of the temple. This was the request which was made to Vespasian, the emperor, that Yavne and her sages should be saved, even though they knew that Jerusalem itself could not be saved. There's the most extraordinary collection of sages who are present in Yavne under the leadership of Rabban Gamliel. So you have all of our favorite characters: Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Shimon, etc., etc. And they are formulating the Jewish law. And it is a terrible tragedy. For the first time in 410 years, the Jews are now left in exile. And they realize that they need to have some kind of unifying prayer that Jews, knowing not in an uncertain future, that Jews, wherever they are going to be able to recite the same prayers. And in the absence of a temple and a centralized place that all Jews can look to, at least prayer will take its place, and there'll be one prayer that everybody can sign up to, and to say, this is the place at which we connect with each other and with God. There is an ancient prayer. It's about 500 years old. It was formulated at the beginning of the Second Temple, which stood for 410 years. And now we are some years after that. So it's around about 500 years old, the beginning of the Second Temple, after the first exile into Babylon, after the destruction of the First Temple. The sages of that time, another very extraordinary group of people called the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, had also decided that because of the uncertainties, because of the experience of exile, because of what had happened in Babylon, and the fact that large numbers, majority of Jews had decided to remain in Babylon and not to come back to Jerusalem at all, that they had at that point in time decided they needed to have a unifying prayer. And so they composed something which was called the 18 Blessings. That was 500 years ago. And temple is not around prayer, temple is around ritual. So the sages now in Yavne can't remember all the details of that prayer. But they know that it was there, and that it was important, and that it was very ancient, and that it had been formulated on ancient principles. So they want to reconstruct it. And so Rabbi Shimon HaPakuli, Rabbi Shimon, who is a cotton merchant, stands up in front of Rabban Gamliel, in the presence, of course, of all the sages, and they start a discussion about this prayer, what it consists of, and the order in which it should be. There is one hugely important principle. The blessing with which we lead into the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, is Baruch Atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, blessed are you, Lord, who has redeemed Israel. And the sages set a principle that there should be nothing that interferes with that blessing of redemption and the beginning of the Amidah. Possibly because the only hope of redemption at that point in time is going to come through prayer. And so they want to create a connection between the two of them, between redemption and prayer. Or possibly because not just in a national sense of redemption, but that the personal redemptive process, the way in which a person himself is redeemed, the way in which they connect with God is going to be through prayer. So redemption and prayer have to follow one and the other without any interruption between them. From Ga'al Yisrael, you've got to stand and say the Shemona Esra. And then Rabbi Yochanan stands up, says, excuse me, I think that we should be inserting one line between Ga'al Yisrael and Hashem Sefatai Tiftach and O Lord, and the first words of the Amidah. I think that we should be reciting Psalm number 51, verse number 17. Hashem Sefatai Tiftach, O Lord, Sefatai, my peh, my mouth, Tiftach, open, Vagid Tfilatecha, and I will then declare your praise. The sages are outraged. What do you mean? You can't have an interposition. We've just set this principle that tefillah has to follow on geula. And now all of a sudden you want to come and stick a piece of psalm in over there? O Lord, open my lips and my mouth shall declare your praise. My heart, my tongue shall declare your praise. So they say to Rabbi Yochanan, Mazeh, what is this? And there's a whole big discussion. And they come to the conclusion that it's going to be okay. This is also going to be part of prayer. And since it is part of the prayer, it doesn't constitute an interposition. We have to ask the question, what was in Rabbi Yochanan's mind? What is it that he's trying to say? What do these words mean? Hashem Sefatai Tiftach Ufi Yagid Tilatecha, and my mouth shall declare your praise. So you could answer it very simply and say, all that he means over here is that before you stand up and pray to God, before you stand in his presence, you need to ask permission to do so. Please, God, open my mouth and my lips shall declare your praise. I'm asking permission. But it's possible that he was actually trying to say something much deeper than that. It's possible that he was actually trying to introduce a profound idea that you can't begin to pray before you have accepted a new and deeper realization. It's perhaps that he's thinking about Proverbs chapter 16, verse number 1. The preparations of the heart are man's, but the answer of the tongue is the Lord's, says King Solomon in Proverbs. You can make whatever preparations in your heart you want in terms of what you think you're going to do. But it is God that enables you to do it. If you did not have the power of speech, if you couldn't open your mouth and say the words and mouth them and think them and feel them, if that gift were not given to you from God, it doesn't matter what you prepared in your heart, it would go nowhere. Have you ever had the sad experience of trying to communicate with somebody who's had a stroke and lost their power of speech? And you see the way in which they struggle because in their heart, inside, they know what they want to say, but they can't find the words. They simply cannot formulate the words of speech. We take this so much for granted. Here I'm speaking to you. The words just flow out from our mind just without any effort at all. It's such a natural process. And yet throughout the day, whatever we do, whatever thoughts, as King David said, Rabot machshavot belevish, there are many, many different thoughts in a person's heart. But what God wants, hu yakum, that's what's going to actually happen. We are helpless until God gives us the power to open our mouths and to allow that which is in our heart to flow out. So what Rabbi Yochanan was doing here, and the reason why the sages accepted and said, yes, this is actually part of prayer, is because he gave them a new insight. It's all very well to stand up and to pray, but hey, who gave you the ability to do that? That's really humbling. So you stand from the very outset, you begin with a profound sense of humility. The very fact that I can stand and address God, whoever he is, wherever he is, whatever he is. But the very fact that I can do this as a human being is because he's actually given me the ability to do it. And that's the way in which we enter into our prayer. Hashem sefatai tiftach. You open my mouth, and then I'll be able to express your prayer, your praise. And then we begin with the first paragraph of the Amidah. So let me leave you with a cliffhanger for tomorrow. Everybody knows the first paragraph of the Amidah. Lekei Abraham, Lekei Yitzhak, Yaakov, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, Hakel HaGadol, HaGibor, HaNorah, the great mighty. There is one word missing from that prayer that when I mention it to you, you'll immediately recognize it. Throughout all of our prayers, the whole of Rosh Hashanah, every one of the blessings we have, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, King of the world, King of the universe. God's sovereignty is absolutely central to all of Judaism, to our whole relationship with God. We're now going to stand and address God, and the one word that is missing from that first blessing is the word Melech, King. Why? That's for tomorrow. Where, of course, you would expect it to be, because it is such a central concept. This is quite widely discussed by the sages. Tosafot give their own answer, and they say that when we say the God of Abraham, that is equivalent to actually mentioning God's sovereignty. And the reason is because Avraham Avinu established God's sovereignty over the whole world by proclaiming that the Holy One, blessed be he, is the king. So it's implicit in that respect. The Tur, Yaakov ben Asher, in the Shulchan Aruch, gives something of a similar answer, that it's implied, it's somewhere there, because the words Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanorah, great and mighty and revered, are the equivalent of mentioning God's sovereignty. So in a sense, you don't actually need to articulate the words Melech HaOlam. I have two other thoughts that I'd like to add to this. One is that, after all, the whole of the Shema, which we've just recited, which has to connect back with the Amidah, is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. This is the moment in which we accept the sovereignty of God over us. And it is still with that mood that we come into the Amidah, so we're already there. It's unnecessary to open the gate again. Once you've opened the gate, accepted the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a sovereign king, you step into the Amidah, and there's no sense, therefore, of once again calling him Melech HaOlam. That's one suggestion. The second suggestion I have, and this is not anywhere in the sources, it's just my own thinking over here, is that actually in the Amidah, you don't want to mention Melech HaOlam, because it's something which we have to reach by ourselves. It's not something which we want to have imposed upon us. We don't want to say the appellation Melech HaOlam. The whole idea of the Amidah is that we should take this idea of Melech HaOlam that we have already articulated in the Shema and make it real in our lives in terms of all the things that we're asking for, to recognize that things like our knowledge, our health, our parnassah, our living, all those things, all the coming together of the Jewish nation, all the stuff which will come up in the Amidah, all of that is about making Melech HaOlam real in our lives. And that's the avodah, that's the work which we ourselves need to do. So that would be my suggestion about Melech HaOlam. I want to talk in broader terms about this first blessing, and then start looking at it in detail. And I want to introduce this discussion with a little story which I heard quite a number of years ago from Clive Lawton, the educator Clive Lawton. And he tells a story that on one occasion he was as a young man, he was traveling around India, and he found himself, as apparently one does, at a train station, in a railway station, somewhere very early in the morning, waiting for a train to travel somewhere else. And there are lots of people sitting around in the waiting room. It's very early, it's just at dawn. And as the sun rises, and they're all waiting for this train to arrive in some time ahead, he notices a whole lot of activity going on in the room. Suddenly, he just becomes aware of the fact that things are happening. And he looks a bit more carefully, and he sees that one person, who's obviously a Muslim, is trying to make a bit of space, and he's got his mat, and he's laying out his mat because he's going to start in prayer. And he looks around the other side of the room, and there's a Sikh who is with his wife. He's taken his turban off, and he's rolling up his turban, preparing his turban, to put it back. He's preparing for prayer, and all around him, and he's sitting over there, by the way, sorry, I just forgot to mention, he's having conniptions because he's in this crowded room and he's feeling embarrassed about standing up as a Jew and putting on tefillin. Okay. And then he sees all around him that everybody is getting ready for prayer. The whole room is getting ready for prayer. Everyone, men, women, everyone else. And he says, suddenly, he says, the penny drops. He says, he has no shame whatsoever about putting on tefillin because, and he does it in the room because he realizes that in the East, where people are still connected, he said, people wouldn't dream of starting the day without locating themselves first in the universe. And it's only in this crazy West where we've gotten to this mad kind of rush of waking up at the crack of dawn, gulping down a cup of coffee, jumping to our cars, getting stuck in a traffic jam for an hour to get to work, frantic to get to our desks so we can start our day, etc., where we've lost this idea that you start the day by locating yourself in the universe. And this is the big lesson that he learns from India, from the East. So it seems to me that the Amidah, and particularly the first paragraph of the Amidah, is the way in which we locate ourselves as Jews in the universe each morning. And it's like a GPS. Have you ever seen, it happens very quickly these days, but it used to take a lot longer when GPS wasn't quite as sophisticated and advanced. But you see, when you turned on your GPS device, it would go through a process of locating the satellites to get your 3-point fix, yes? And eventually, after a little while, if you're standing outdoors, suddenly you've got a fix and you know where you are in the world. Okay? This first paragraph of the Amidah is the way in which we actually fix our location in the world, the way in which we fix our identity in the world. It's a very, very important paragraph. And over the next couple of days, I would like to break it open and to ask this question, what is the nature of this fix? And how do we go about exercising it so that we do something of significance to start our day? And I really believe that it is all contained in this first blessing and the genius with which the sages have ordered the words and its structure to help us to find our place in the world. And for that, we have to come back again tomorrow. Okay, so by the way, just to finish off on this business of why Melech doesn't appear in the first blessing of the Amidah, one of our attentive participants in the morning group wrote to me, sent an email and said, but hang on a second, look very carefully at the first blessing and you see that Melech is mentioned, because as soon as one has completed the first paragraph, it goes on to say, Melech Ozer Meshil Magen, King, Helper, Savior, and Shield. So what's all this business about Melech not being mentioned? So the answer to that, I think, is twofold. The first is that listening to a shiur should be no different to listening to a sermon. It's time for sleeping, not for listening. So you have no right to ask the question to start with. Okay, you should have been fast asleep. You shouldn't have been paying attention. The second answer is, however, that insofar as both the Tosafot and later on Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, the Tur, want to comment on the fact that Melech is not mentioned, it seems that they're not satisfied with your answer, because they surely also knew that Melech appears in the place that you've pointed out towards the end of the first paragraph. But I think the issue is that when we begin to describe the special qualities of God, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, that's the point at which you want to say Melech HaOlam, King of the world, and it doesn't appear there. And I think that's the fundamental problem for them. At any rate, let's move on a little bit, because yesterday we spoke about how this first paragraph is our kind of GPS spiritual fix for the day, the place at which we locate ourselves. So I just want to say something about identity first, because it's something which we take for granted. All of us, people of sound mind, have an awareness of who we are. So we know, for example, the address at which we live. We are aware of who we live with, who's in our home with us. We're aware of our parents. We have some kind of awareness of where they come from without sometimes specific knowledge. But I know that my parents came from somewhere in Latvia and Lithuania, etc. So I have a sense of history. One knows who one's siblings are. You know who your children are if you're married. You know your friends are. You know where you are located in the world. You have an identity. You know, one of the things which happens immediately after a trauma is when the doctors start to speak to you. They ask you questions like, what's your name? What's your address? Where do you live? Meaning to say that this is the fix that a person has about who I am. I'm not a rootless person. I know who I am when I come. A person who's lost their memory has lost their identity. So that's a very deep part of all of us that we carry around with us all the time. And it's very precious, because that's how we locate ourselves in the world. By the way, it's not always the case that people have that. And I've told the story many times because it left such a big impression on me when we had a security guard called Patrick many, many years ago, who was a very large American black, an ex-Marine. And one night we were in the old shul, we were having a Friday night dinner for a simcha of some kind. And I walked out of the hall for a moment, came back in again, and the hall, if you recall, had glass panels on the doors. You could look into the room. And I saw Patrick standing over there with such a wistful look on his face, looking into the room. And I said to him, Patrick, what are you thinking? He was a very sensitive, intelligent man. And he said to me, Shlomo, says, I'm filled with envy for the people inside that room, sitting there, eating, laughing, and enjoying themselves. All of them know exactly who they are and where they belong. He said, I am a rootless American black. I don't have that sense of who I am. And so we carry this with us and we take it for granted. It's terribly important. There is one other part of our identity that we carry with us all the time, and certainly for all the people who are participating in our morning services over here and have elected to go through this little ritual of praying together, we have another part of our identity that we carry with us all the time and is terribly important for us, and it's the fact that we are Jews. I just have to tell you a story again, because my niece, who grew up in Canada in a family that is not very strongly identified at all, my sister's family, where her husband is a profound atheist and not a believer, very nice and moral man and everything else, but religion wasn't part of their children's upbringing. And she went on birthright. And she was generally on birthright towards the end of the trip. The participants have an audience with the Prime Minister of the time. On this occasion, when Ariel Sharon was still Prime Minister, he said he didn't want to meet a whole group. He wanted instead to just meet a representative, three representatives of the group, so he could have a more intimate conversation with them. And my niece was one of the one who was chosen. And she describes the this interaction with the Prime Minister of Israel. The three of them traipse into his office and sit down at chairs which are laid out for them, and he's sitting on the other side of a desk. And he is completely and totally silent for a very long time. He says nothing. And they're sitting there, getting more and more, feeling more and more uncomfortable. And then eventually he looks up at them, and the first words that he speaks says, "I want you to know that the most important thing in my life is that I am a Jew." And she has never recovered from that experience. It just hit her like a sledgehammer. That was his core identity. Not I'm an Israeli, I am a Jew. So this thing called Jew is very, very much deeply part of our identity. We carry it with us all the time. It's part of knowing who we are. I'm sure it may be the same thing for Muslim, for Christian, for Hindu, for Sikh, for Buddhist, I don't know. I only know that it is something which is so important, so much part of my life, of my identity, that it sits with me all the time. Now, when we stand up before God to speak to him in an intimate way, it's this sense of I'm a Jew, this identity that we approach with, and in the formula of these words, in their order and in the choice of words, that sense of who I am as a Jew is augmented and expanded and deepened. And that is what the first blessing of the Amidah is intended to do. That's what I mean by saying that one locates oneself in the universe in the morning, first thing when you stand up to pray. So I wanted to look at some of these words. And if I can take the analogy that I used yesterday, that this is a GPS fix. And in a GPS fix, you need to have at least 3 satellites triangulated in order to be able to fix on. I believe that in this blessing over here, there are those 3 constellations that we fix on, where we triangulate on, in order to be able to give us our sense of Jewish identity. There are some other stars and constellations as well, which are secondary, which are important as well, but there are 3. And the three that we want to look at over here are the following. Why is it that we say, my God, before we say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Surely they come first. And he's only our God because he was their God. And yet the sages chose to put my God first. That's the first issue we need to look at. The second is, if he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then just say it. Instead, we say the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Were they different gods, or were they the same God? And the third issue we need to look at is, having mentioned that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we end the blessing not by saying, blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We end the blessing by saying, Magen Avraham, the God only of Abraham. So what happened? He stopped being the God of Isaac and Jacob all of a sudden? So these are puzzles in this blessing over here. There are others as well, but these are the 3 main ones. We are running out of time, so I just want to touch on the first of these questions over here. Why it is that we refer to him as my God before we refer to him as the God of our patriarchs who came before us. There is a book of explanation in the prayers called Otsar HaTefillah. It's an important book because it's one which explanations are given for all the prayers, and he makes some beautiful comments in this regard. He says, you don't believe in God because your father did. You have to, in the first instance, believe in God because you have made him God for you. Only after that can you begin to talk about the others. But to have a God who's only your God because you have relied upon the fact that he was the God of your father or the God of your ancestors or the God of Abraham, etc., is laziness. It leads you nowhere. It's just empty tradition. There's nothing that is relevant to you in your life other than I know where I come from. But that's not what God is about. God is about a struggle that I have to find my place in the world, my relationship with him. And that's preeminent. That's what comes first. And as Otsatafila says, the first thing one has to do is to be able to use one's own intellect, one's own emotions, etc., in this journey of discovery to find out who is this God and how do I relate to him and what does he mean in my life? And only when you have exhausted the possibilities and you can go no further and you discover that there are things which you simply don't understand, then you can turn to the tradition that has been handed down to us by others who've explained to us how they saw God and how they understood it. So that's when you have Kabbalah and tradition handed down, insights, beautiful insights, etc. But it has to be yours first. And that was a major insight that the sages wanted to offer us in this prayer over here. So the first fix when a person stands up over here of our three fixes is, here I'm standing in front of God. And the question is, and so what does it mean to me? That's all. What does it mean to me? Who's this dude up over there?
Shlomo.
How do I relate to him? Okay, right. One more story I want to tell you because it just remembered it now. It occurred to me in yeshiva. I was in yeshiva at the time, and back in 1968, 69, which was a time of huge discovery in the world. American hippies were very, very much searching. There was a young man in yeshiva with me, and he told me the way in which he'd found his way back into Judaism. He said he was a hippie, and he turned up for some reason or another in 770 Eastern Parkway on a Yom Tov, sort of barefooted with lots of beads around his neck and a long ponytail and everything else. And this, of course, is where the Lubavitcher Rebbe, lived and had his minyan and thousands of people over there, etc. He's completely out of it. He's got no idea what's going on. He has very little Jewish identity. He's kind of like rolled into the place. Some Chabad shaliach must have sent him there. It's a complete and total mistake. He doesn't know why he's there. He doesn't understand a word. It's all in Hebrew. There are thousands of Jews around him. He's lost completely. Suddenly it comes to the point of Birkat Kohanim. And suddenly an elderly Jew, who turns out to be an old Russian Jew, an old man who's standing next to him, takes his talit and brings him under his talit for Birkat Kohanim. And he said that was the turning point of his life. He was embraced, he was brought in to the tent of Jewish identity in that moment. And that is how he decided, that is why he decided to seek out his Jewish identity. That's sometimes the way in which our identity comes to us. We have these epiphanal moments in our lives, which are terribly important. But nevertheless, that's the beginning of the Amidah, and we'll look at some of the other aspects of it tomorrow. So we are looking at the Amidah and the first blessing, and yesterday we asked the question why we say our God first, and then only after that the God of our fathers, when logically speaking, chronologically speaking, we should say the God of our fathers first, and because they came before us, and then only after that they set the path for us and it came down to us and becomes our God as well by way of inheritance. And the answer to that question was that it is a very important that a person establishes their own relationship with God first before they can even then turn to the bigger picture of the relationship that is handed down to us by tradition from the patriarchs. In a similar vein, one wants to ask another question in relation to the first paragraph, and that is the fact that when we mention Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we say the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, when for the purposes of elegance, it would be better simply to say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the answer to that is, first of all, one should understand a lot of our prayers are very, very carefully culled from biblical reference. And the sages will be turning back into the actual text of Torah in order to be able to find terminology that they want to bring into our prayers, both because it would give us an echo of a reminder of its source if we're sufficiently knowledgeable, but also because if it's written in the Torah, it's written there for a purpose. And for that reason, therefore, one wants to turn back to authentic text rather than to make up words and phrases oneself. And the place where we would see this in the Torah is in regard to when Moses is sent to the children of Israel and to tell them who it is, who's the source of, he's the messenger, and who is sending him. And he says, so this is what you shall say to the children of Israel: the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. And there you find this exact same formula, the God of, the God of, and the God of. So our question therefore becomes not a question on the Amidah, but a question actually on the Chumash itself, on the Bible, as to why that's the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu has chosen to express himself. And it may be that 2 points. One is that in the same way that we have to make God our own, so too we do not have a concept in Judaism of a collective God, a God who is simply there in the same way for everyone. For there is, of course, one God, but for every human being, including Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, there has to be a sense of personalization, has to become their God, as opposed to the God in abstract. But I think a deeper reason is because from each one of these three patriarchs, we learn something when I speak about this first paragraph being our spiritual GPS fix, and the way in which we need to actually take our own sense of energy and connectedness from this paragraph. So what we see about Abraham is that he is the person who fearlessly stands by his faith, even though it's in contradistinction to what everybody else is believing in the world. That is the primary feature of Abraham, the man who declares that there's one God and sticks by it. And what you see in the life of Yitzchak is his preparedness to be able to die for the belief in God. He's prepared to put himself as a grown man on the altar, etc., and to die for these beliefs. The level of devotion and dedication to the concept of an unseen God. And what we learn from Jacob is the way in which sometimes one has to be prepared to suffer for truth and for one's principles. So here we have in the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, powerful messages that come down to us about the nature of our own Jewish faith, as epitomized by those qualities of Abraham and of Isaac and Jacob, each one of them unique, and each one of them another pillar of our connectedness to the God of Israel as we stand there in front of him. And that then begins to answer a further question that I raised yesterday. And I said there were three primary questions we want to ask about this. One was why we have my God before the God of my fathers. Second question we've just dealt with as to why each one is individualized with God in their name. And the third was that having mentioned all three of them, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, when we conclude the blessing, we mention only one of them, Magen Avraham, the God of Abraham. Once again, this has a biblical source, and it is taken from the Talmud, in Talmud Pesachim, when they say, when God promises to Abraham that I will make you a great nation, and it says the Talmud, that means that people will say, the God of Abraham, and I will bless you. That means that people will say the God of Isaac, because he was blessed with a child after so many years. And I will make your name great. That means people will say the God of Jacob, because he raised the 12 tribes, and etc., etc. And then you might think, says the Talmud, that you'll conclude with referring to all of them, and therefore, says the verse continuing, and you shall be for a blessing. Meaning to say that when it comes to the blessing at the end, it is only you, and that is why we have Magen, Baruch Atah Hashem, the blessing Magen Avraham, and not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that, once again, is the Talmudic source for the formulation of this over here. And again, one needs to try and delve into the Talmud to understand why they're interpreting it in this particular way. And it seems to me, and I say this by way of speculation without any source, that when you look at the contribution of each one of the three, the primary one that we have to live with all the time is that our whole sense of standing in front of an unseen God and speaking to him and asking him to speak to us, all of that profound concept, revolutionary concept, of course, comes from Abraham. And that is why we have to refer to him as Magen Avraham, because of the three, for each one of their contribution, it is Avraham who gives us our fundamental identity as Jews. That then explains some of these 3 points over here. And tomorrow we're going to look at some of the other elements in this, what we have always seen as you rattle through this prayer as just formulistic, but as you begin to unpack it, you begin to realize that actually it's very complex, and that there's a lot which is swilling beneath the surface over here. Tomorrow we're going to look at some of the other elements over here, which are both fascinating and hopefully instructive as well. And we've connected ourselves, we've put ourselves in historical context, our own sense of Jewish identity, all of that which flows from the first blessing. Now we're standing in front of the Almighty, and we are aware of his powerful omnipotence in the world, that this is truly the ruler of our universe, with absolute, complete, total power over everything which happens in the universe, over our lives, over the lives of every creature. How would you want to express that? What would you focus on? Would you want to talk about the vastness of the universe, that huge big place beyond space, which we don't, with the most powerful telescopes, we still don't understand? Would you want to talk about what happens in the depths of the sea, the extraordinary miracle of life, of teeming life on earth? You open your hand and you give life to every creature in the world receives its sustenance on a daily basis. The awesomeness of the universe and the power of God and the power of control of history. None of that is what is expressed in this prayer. Instead, the dominant theme of the gvurot, of the power of God, is techiyat hametim. As a matter of fact, it is so dominant that in the course of this single small blessing, it's mentioned 3 times. Here it is. Ata gibor olam Hashem, mechaya metim ata. You bring the dead back to life. Rav lehoshia, great is your salvation. Mechalkel chayim b'chesed. Mechaya metim barachamim rabim. You vivify the dead, bring the dead back to life in great mercy. That's the 2nd time. And the 3rd time is that we come to the end of the blessing, Baruch Atah Hashem. How do we want to express God's power in this universe? Machaye hametim, the one who vivifies the dead. So the obvious question is, why? Why choose this as the way to express God's power, omnipotence in the world? So we want to explore this, and there'll be a number of explanations. Let me, first of all, give you one which is the simplest explanation, but the one which in one respect is the most unsatisfying. Remember once again where these prayers are being formulated. This is Rabbi Shimon HaPokuli, Shimon the cotton merchant, standing in front of Rabban Gamliel in Yavne after the destruction of the first temple, reconstructing an ancient prayer. And they're coming to the prayer which they knew was always spoken about, a prayer relating to God's might in the world. And this is a very, very confusing time. There are multiple sects around. These are the Sadducees, who are very powerful, who are not believers in the oral law. They're believers only in the written law. There are other sects around as well. Judaism is just establishing itself in terms of the rabbinic Judaism that we know to this day. And one of the strong beliefs or disbeliefs of the Sadducees was they did not believe in Techiyat HaMetim, because it doesn't appear to be mentioned explicitly in the 5 books of Moses. And so they don't have a belief that there is something which happens beyond life, or that God has the ability, that the soul is immortal, that it continues, and that bodies can once again be resurrected, that life can once again be established on earth. So in response to this, the sages have to very forcefully introduce this idea. No, this is a principal idea that exists within Judaism, Techiyat HaMetim, and they said not once, they said not twice, and they said 3 times. And that's a very basic explanation as to why Techiyat HaMetim is a theme. But as I say, one that is very unsatisfying, because it doesn't quite answer, doesn't speak to me standing in front of the Almighty in the Amidah. And we'll want to find some other more satisfying answers than that. But before we do that, we just need to note that the whole notion of Techiyat HaMetim is indeed the idea that there can be a resurrection of the dead, which, by the way, is so fundamental to our thinking that every time we go to a funeral, as you know, we stand and read before we enter the grounds this passage over here, Machai Metim Atarav Loshia, and we speak about resurrection of the dead. As we are burying our dead, we actually declare at the funeral the resurrection of the dead, that one day the dead will become alive again. And it is so difficult to understand that even Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the author of the Kuzari, says, and one should bear in mind that he will revive the dead whenever he desires, and however far this may be removed from the speculations of natural philosophers. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi acknowledges that this is a very, very difficult concept for a person to believe in, let alone, or you can't grasp it, but let alone believe in it. Nevertheless, we do find it mentioned a number of times, if not directly in the actual 5 books of Moses. We have, of course, as you know, 3 occurrences. 3 times in this blessing we have Machaya Metim. There are 3 direct occurrences which are described in Nach, in the story of in the Bible. The first is, of course, the famous story of the way in which Elijah brings a child back to life. And later on, his disciple Elisha does it twice. So there are the 3 times that Techiyat HaMetim is actually mentioned in the story, in the biblical stories, in the Book of Kings. Then later on, we have the great story of Ezekiel, the dry bones, one of the Haftarot which we read, a vision of the future, that the way in which the dead bones, and many people see this as metaphoric, that this is about the nation of Israel coming alive again after the exile and after the exile into Babylon, but nevertheless a vivid imagery of life again. And then you have 2 verses which are absolutely explicit, where you simply can't escape it. Again, they're not in the 5 books of Moses, which is the problem which the Sadducees have, but there are in Isaiah, in chapter 26:19. The dead shall live, my dead bodies shall rise. And in the book of Daniel, many of those who sleep in the dust shall awaken. So this is an idea which is very central, therefore, to Jewish thinking. And to suggest that the only reason why it's been put over here when we want to describe the greatness and the power of God is because we want to knock it on the head against the Sadducees and implant it as a Jewish idea is an idea, but not one that I want to travel with as we go further. Instead, I want to point to two other reasons as to why these blessings are mentioned altogether and why they're going to be mentioned 3 times. And it is all to do with the fact that in the same way that when we stood before the Almighty in the first blessing, we needed to be able to find some kind of personal connection. We needed to have something which speaks to us. So it was about my relationship as a Jew, my sense of connectedness with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's something very personal and powerful about that. I'm talking to God, not an abstract. I'm talking to him about things which matter to me. I'm relating to him in terms of my life as I stand here as asking for life. And somewhere within this blessing over here, we're going to need to be able to find how this blessing is talking, speaking to us. And for that, we shall have to wait until tomorrow. So we are looking at the second blessing in the Amidah. And yesterday I remarked on the fact that when you look at it, you see that the theme of might is defined by the concept of Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. And it appears 3 times in the blessing. And I asked the question, why such a predominance of this particular theme? Apart from the fact that ordinarily when we think of might, we think of a destructive power. And here in this blessing, with the theme of Techiyat HaMetim, we're talking about might in a way that is actually life-giving as opposed to destructive. But I also wanted to suggest that when we want to approach God and talk to him about his might or to reflect upon his might in the world, the sages didn't want to put it in abstract terms relating to the universe and the greatness of God in the universe. They wanted something that was going to be intensely personal, something that we could relate to ourselves. I mentioned yesterday, by the way, that historically the Sadducees at the time that this prayer was being formulated were not believers in the resurrection of the dead. And there's one suggestion that the reason why it is here re-emphasized 3 times is in order to be able to hit home the idea that, yes, we do believe in it, but we're looking for something a bit more personal than that. And so here are 2 suggestions as to why Techiyat HaMetim is so very important in this prayer. The first is, it's possible that each one of these references of Techiyat HaMetim, each one of the 3 times as being mentioned, actually refers to a different dimension of Techiyat HaMetim. Remember that right at the very beginning of the morning service, in our own private blessings of thanksgiving to the Almighty, we actually already had a blessing that spoke about Techiyat HaMetim in sense of the way in which when we wake up in the morning after having been asleep at night, it's as if we have been brought back to life again. Remember we had the phrase, Hamachazir Nishamot Livgarim Metim. We thank God for being the one who returns life to dead bodies, so to speak. So it's possible, therefore, that as we stand here before HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the second blessing, the first reference to Techiyat HaMetim is actually the very personal one, as, hey, I'm alive. That in itself is kind of miraculous. I have another day to live. I went to sleep and was, as the Talmud says, sleep is a 60th of death. And miraculously in the morning, there's this magic thing called sleep, especially when it works well. And you wake up in the morning and it's like your batteries have been refreshed and it's like you are a new person. So the first sense over here of Techiyat HaMetim is actually saying something to God about the extraordinary way in which he's created life, the need for sleep and the sense of rebirth when a person wakes up in the morning. The second reference to Techiyat HaMeitim, remember that it's in this blessing over here that we insert the special blessing for rain, or at least the mention of rain in the winter time. And rain is the life-giving force of this world. You've seen in the wintertime a tree that looks absolutely dead. There's no life in it whatsoever. And somehow miraculously in the springtime, with the rising of the sap and with rain, that tree comes back to life again and sprouts leaves and is beautiful and filled with leaf. So water is the symbol of resurrection of life in this world. And so we are so hugely dependent upon it. Our bodies are made up of water to a very large extent. We can't exist without water. Water is the life-giving force of this world. You can go for a long time without food. You can't go without water. And water is precious in the world. Many of the crises that we face are because of shortages of water. And as a matter of fact, the sages have said there are three keys that the Almighty has kept to himself and has not been given into the hands of man. One of them is the key of rain. The second is the key of birth, life. And the third is the key of the resurrection of the dead. So this second blessing, therefore, could take us from the sense of my own life and resurrection of my life today through to the next sense of awareness of a resurrection of the world around me with the power of water, resurrection of the dead, so to speak, in a symbolic sense. And then the third one takes us in a leap to the bigger idea of, yes, a resurrection of the dead in the literal sense. And if we didn't have the first two stages, there's no way in which we could approach the third one. Because as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi said in the Kuzari that I quoted yesterday, it is just beyond the rational. It doesn't make sense to us. We can't conceive it. But once we've already understood from our own lives and from the world around us that there is a concept of things that look like they're dead coming alive again, it makes it easier for us to be able to praise God for that third ultimate sense of resurrection of the dead. So what we're saying over here is that this standing before the Almighty and praising his might becomes an intensely personal experience. It's the might that I experience in the world as opposed to something which is abstract and which therefore I can't relate to. And we want to say over here, therefore, that this is a personal God. This is a God who cares about his world. And that is why we insert over here Gomel Chasadim Tovim V'Kanei sorry, long blessing. V'Rofei Cholim Somech Noflim V'Rofei Cholim Umatir Asurim, the one who supports the fallen, heals the sick, sets captives free. These are images of a caring, loving God. His might is expressed in positive things. His might is expressed not in destruction, but in growth, in healing, in vivifying, in life force, in energy. And that's a very powerful message to have to live with in the morning. That as you move through from the first blessing to the second blessing, and we're looking at God's might, this is not the fearful, terrible, awesome God that is depicted sometimes in Bible. You know, the God of the Old Testament, the vengeful God. That is the way sometimes we would want to depict his might, and that doesn't come through at all in this blessing. It's much softer, it's more personal, it's about my life, it's about the energy that's in my life, it's about the energy that's in the world, and it's about some faith for the future. And that will bring us, therefore, to the next explanation as to why, a different explanation based upon the Medrash, as to why there are three mentions of Techiyat HaMeitim in this blessing. But for that, we're going to have to wait for tomorrow. So we come back now to the second blessing of the Amidah, which, and as we've shown over the last couple of days, there then is this threefold repetition of Techiyat HaMeitim. There are some really astounding and very powerful and inspiring ideas. And I want to just now conclude our discussion of the second blessing by pointing out in the first instance, something of the language. Rav Lohoshia, the expression Rav Lohoshia apparently comes from the book of Isaiah. As always, the wording and the phraseology of the Amidah are deeply rooted in biblical verses. The idea of Matzmiach Yeshua, causing salvation to spring forth. And a little bit later on, the idea that Somech Noflim, Rofei Cholim, Matir Asurim, supporting the falling, healing the sick, and freeing the bound. These expressions, all of them are consistent with the theme that I've wanted to make, that when we speak about God's power and his might, very often that is seen as something which is completely destructive, you know, the God of anger in the Christian sense. Here we use expressions that are ones of salvation, of healing, of building, etc. And in relation to these three phases, supporting the falling, healing the sick, freeing the bound, we are saying that God's exercise of his might is different to that of human actions, because when human beings exert power, they normally use it to degrade others and to subdue them. We have just seen, the world has just seen a perfect example of that, and we've seen the outcome of what happens when people exercise power in a way that degrades others. It leads to total, absolute chaos. And here we are saying in this blessing over here that God's power is one that actually produces the opposite effect. It builds, it heals, it brings salvation. This is the God of mercy, not the God of anger. And finally, to point out something from a very famous book called Sefer HaIkarim by Rabbi Yosef Alba, who was a 15th century sage, widely quoted. And he points out that in the benching, we have the expression b'chein u'v'chesed u'v'rachamim, with grace, with kindness, and with mercy. And it doesn't say rachamim rabim, great mercy. In the Amidah, we use the expression rachamim rabim, great mercy. So he asks the question, how come in benching, when we are in any event invoking God's rachamim, how come it's only rachamim and not rachamim rabim, great rachamim? And he gives an amazing answer. He says the whole idea of benching is the way in which God sustains us through food. And chen and chesed and rachamim represents the way in which God sustains us through the three stages of our lives: our younger years, our mid years, and our later years. Throughout our lives, we have to eat, but he says the effect of food on us is different. The amount of food and what it does for us changes at each one of those stages. In the early years, when we have growth, a little bit of food comes in. The more food comes in than goes out, he says, because we are in a growth stage, etc. So food sustains us, and we don't need that much support from the Almighty. So we get just chen, just grace, God's grace, which keeps us going. A little bit later on, when you come to your mid-years, the situation begins to change, and one's metabolism changes as well. And there, as you come to your mid-years, you need a little bit more help, because the effect of the food compared to how much comes in, how much goes out, it's pretty much equally, says, and therefore you need a little bit more help from God to stay alive over and above the food that he gives us as sustenance. So therefore you get chesed, you get his kindness, he's inputted more into our lives. And then we come to the later years. And as you know, as you get to the later years, all the wheels begin to fall off. Everything, we are in the danger zone. Things begin to go wrong. Bodies begin, there's built-in obsolescence. Things begin to break. Problems begin to rise. Health issues, etc. You begin to kvetch a little bit more. You have to see the doctor more often. You want more medication. The knees begin to give in. The back is gewalt, getting out of bed in the morning. So by the time you get there, he said, the food is just not working so well, because the whole metabolism has changed dramatically. You see, by then, the amount that comes in compared to the amount which goes out. He said that what comes in, the nourishment, works less well. By this stage, you're turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you need a lot more help from him to stay alive. And therefore, we come to Rachamim. So the first stage of life is Chesed. The second stage of life, first stage of life is Chen. The second stage of life is Chesed. And the third stage of life is Rachamim. Uva Chen, Uva Chesed, Uva Rachamim. A beautiful explanation of benching and of the food that sustains us. So benching takes on a whole different dimension. This is about God sustaining us in life, not just saying thank you for food, for sustenance. And then, however, for the sake of Techiyat HaMeitim, to resurrect the dead, Rachamim by itself is just not going to work. To come back alive again, the revivification of a human being, this needs Rachamim Rabim, this needs a great amount of Rachamim. And that's why in the Amidah, when we talk about Techiyat HaMeitim, it's Rachamim Rabim compared to just Rachamim in the benching. Well, there you are. You know, they say we have a different idea of the three stages of life. There are the younger years, there are the mid years, and there's, hey, you look terrific. And of course, when you say it, you don't really mean it anyway, but you say it to be nice. Okay, that completes therefore the second of our blessings. And we're going to start exploring from tomorrow the concept of Kedusha, why it is that the third blessing has to be Kadosh. Of the Amidah is the blessing of holiness. And it's very short. It reads, Ata Kadosh, you're holy, V'shimcha Kadosh, and your name is holy. V'kadoshim b'chol yom yahalucha, and the holy ones bless you each day. Baruch Ata Hashem, blessed are you, Hakel HaKadosh, the holy God. So a couple of questions which we're going to have to answer in the course of this very short blessing. Ata Kadosh v'shimcha Kadosh, you are holy and your name is holy. What does that mean? If you are holy, what's the name? What is it, the name being holy, and why do we need to mention them both? And Kadoshim b'cholim mehalucha sela, and the holy ones praise you every day. Who are the holy ones that we're referring to over here? I said that it's a short blessing, but actually it's jam-packed full with important concepts. The first thing to mention about this is a comment that was made by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari, in which he notes that this blessing is fundamentally different to the two that preceded it. Up until now, in the first blessing of the Avot, of the patriarchs, that was about a very personal God, a God with whom we're deeply connected, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, my God, the God who's a personal God, the one who's involved in my life, who cares about me, is involved in the world. The second blessing as well, and God's might, we worked really hard to try and explain how this is actually a deeply personal, this is about me and about my life and the way in which God vivifies me, and that his entire might and power and his omnipotence is all directed towards me as a little fragile human being and sustaining me in life, lifting me up when I'm fallen, nourishing me, etc. This is a personal God. And says the Yehuda Levi, however, having read those first two paragraphs, when we come to this third one, this is very different, because this is about a God who is completely and totally beyond our comprehension, beyond the world, seemingly a God who is so transcendent, so beyond, that there's no sense of connection between me and him, because this power, this force is beyond my ability to comprehend. And this was emphasized by the great sage, the Malbim, when he comments on a phrase which we know very well from our prayers, but which actually is a verse in Isaiah: Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzavakot, Meloch Alaretz Kadosh, holy, 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 the God of hosts. The entire world is filled with his glory. We say this is part of our Kedusha, we say this is part of our prayers. There it is in Isaiah chapter 6, verse number 3. And the Malbim comments on this, and he says, what is the Kadosh, 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 the threefold Kadosh, holiness, which is mentioned over here? And the word Kadosh, we always translate as separate, different, outside, beyond. And he says the first Kadosh is that God has is devoid of form. The second kadosh is that he is devoid of matter. These, of course, by the way, are the Aristotelian concepts of the formation of the world. The whole world is made up of form and of matter. Kadosh and kadosh means that he's beyond form and beyond matter. And the third kadosh is that he's beyond and is everlasting. He's totally beyond the concept of existence and non-existence. They're just ideas, they're concepts which don't apply to him. So here you have this notion of a God who's absolutely beyond. Yeah. And we'd have to ask the question then, so what was in the sages' minds when they inserted this prayer, when they wanted us to transition from that personal God we've spoken about in the first two blessings to this God which is beyond? And I think it's in part because it's a sense of the danger of shrinking God to our own small understanding. In other words, bringing him down to our level, because we can only conceive some things in finite terms. We tend to say, okay, so what's my idea of big? So I understand what small is, and big means not small. Bigger, okay, I can think of something bigger. Think of the biggest thing that you can think of. Oh, it's absolutely huge, huge, but it's still only in my mind. There's a lovely story I heard many years ago about that illustrates this point beautifully, about the limitations of human thought, how we have to think within our own idiom. So this is a town of Russian peasants, and it's before the age, it's still in the horse-drawn age, and railways and trains have only just been invented. Nobody's actually ever seen a train before. They only know about horses and carts. So one of the inhabitants of this little town travels off to the large city. He goes off to Moscow. And this is a big event because nobody from this village ever moves away from, strays out of the village. So when this person comes back, they sit him down in the shul and they say, tell us about all the things that you saw, the wonders of the big city. And he sits there and says, I saw something absolutely amazing. I saw a cart that is being pulled without a horse. I said, no, that can't be. He said, yes, it goes by itself. There's a lot of smoke and everything else, but it goes by itself. Of course, he is trying to explain that he's seen a train, an engine with a train. And he describes to him this great wonder, how there's all these carriages which are joined together, and there's the front carriage pulls all the others, and there's no horse to be seen at all. And it's an absolute wonder. And the people are sitting there, they're astonished, their eyes are wide. And there's an elderly, sagely man over there, and he's sitting there, and he's stroking his beard. And at the end he says, "Younger man," he says, "young man," he says, "you are mistaken. You have been deceived." He says, "Inside that front carriage, there must be," he said in Yiddish, "a kleine Pferdele, a little horse. There must be at least a little horse there." And the reason is because he can't think beyond horses. Horses pull carriages. The idea that you can transcend that concept and go beyond it was too difficult for him. So that is the problem that every human being has in terms of conceiving, in terms of understanding. So to make this great sense of a jump, the sense of that there's something absolutely, totally beyond, higher, was something which the sages wanted to implement into our thinking over here, just before, so that we don't become too comfortable with this personal God who's the one who's looking after me and is in my life, and we've shrunk him down to our size. And God can't be shrunken down to our size. That's one of the problems we have with God, that he doesn't do it the way we think. You see, if God were to behave the way we'd like him to behave, if we were God, we'd create a different world, right? We'd do things differently. Our lives would be different, but God doesn't operate that way. So we need to actually create this distance. So that's the first point about Atah Kadosh. But actually it doesn't end there, because when you start looking at some of the other commentaries, they want to bring us back again to say, actually, this is not an abstract concept. This idea of talking about the holiness of God is there purposefully, not just to give us a sense of the dimension of the beyondness, but it is actually saying something to us in our lives on a daily basis as well. And it's at that point that this entire blessing begins to open up in ways which we'll describe, please God, over the next couple of days. And so we've been talking about the third blessing in the Amidah, Ata Kadosh, Shimcha Kadosh, you're holy, your name is holy, whatever that means, we'll come to that. And we've spoken about the way in which this blessing differentiates from the previous two, which appear to be very personal, in the way in which we connect with our identity through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, and God who is, in his power, is the one who's involved in our lives, Rofei Cholim Matir Asurim, one who lifts us up and brings Yeshua, Matzimech Yeshuot, brings salvation, etc. And then suddenly we come to this concept of Ata Kadosh, which is so completely abstract and beyond our understanding, something which is beyond our ability to grasp. Not entirely true, because this blessing too has an element of inspirational nature for us in a personal sense. And it lies in the phrase, Ukedoshim Yahalu Chasela, and the holy ones will praise you. And the question is, who are the holy ones who are praising God? One explanation is, it's the angels. But the other explanation is that these Kadoshim, these holy ones who are praising the Almighty and declaring Ata Kadosh, Shimcha Kadosh, and you are so beyond everything else, these Kadoshim are none other than we ourselves. We are the Kadoshim. And so immediately a connection is made in this prayer between this abstract concept of transcendence and beyondness called Kedusha, and something that we aspire to ourselves in our own Jewishness, in our own lives, in our own prayers. We connect the Almighty's Kedusha, his sanctity and his holiness, with our own aspirations to be Kadosh. And the question therefore is, what does Kedusha look like in human terms? What is it that we're trying to achieve as holy human beings? Two explanations we're going to explore. The first one is from Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who is, of course, the famous author of The Path of the Just, Mesilat Yesharim, a very famous book. And the second will come from Rav Kook, the great mystic rabbi who was the chief rabbi of Israel for so many years. But today we're going to look at Luzzatto. And he says that holiness is a funny kind of situation because the beginning of it is very hard, but the end of it is a reward. What is the beginning of it? What is the end of it? As the sages said in Yom Tov, the sages of blessed memory said, if one sanctifies himself a little, he is sanctified a great deal. If he sanctifies himself down below, he is sanctified from above. So Luzzatto wants to make a connection between something which comes out of human effort, the result of which is something bigger happens to this person that is beyond their own ability. Something is conferred upon them as a reward, as a result for what they have themselves have done. Something which they simply could not reach by themselves had it not been God-given, a divine gift. So he says, if one sanctifies himself with the holiness of the Creator, in other words, one strives in every single way to live a life of Kedusha, of holiness, even his physical actions begin to take on a sense of holiness. He says a person who lives a life in which they do the things that imitate the Almighty, do all of the actions of caring and of compassion and of living, and if a person in eating and in drinking and in all of the mundane actions of one's life and all the things that one does, if one is focused on the idea of holiness, he says something quite extraordinary can happen to a human being. He said, you become, in his words, you can become like a tabernacle, a sanctuary, an altar. Your life is taken over, you're elevated to become a kadosh. The patriarchs are called a divine chariot. A chariot is simply fulfills the will of the driver. The driver directs the chariot to the place where it goes. A chariot has no will of its own. So what he's suggesting is that if a person subjugates himself in matters of conduct and in matters of refinement, in matters of trying to reach the highest levels of refinement that a human being can reach in terms of searching and aspiring towards Kedusha, then a person is given this gift in which they are, in a sense, the Shekhinah dwells within them, and they become elevated, and they become a godly human being, something which they could not actually achieve by themselves. This, he says, is the idea of Kedusha. He says, holiness, I quote, consists in one's clinging so closely to his God that any deed he might perform does not depart or move from the Blessed One until the very physical objects in which he makes use of become elevated because of his having used them. In this phrase over here is a very profound concept which is elucidated very much by Chassidut. The world, the whole physical world around us, everything in the world has godliness within it. In some instances, it's very deeply buried. There are some places where the godliness and the divine is so deeply buried that it's out of bounds to us as human beings. Those are the things which are prohibited actions for us. They're among the 365 prohibited commandments. We can't go there. But the majority of the world is in a neutral space. And you can take items and objects, and if you use them in the appropriate way, what you're really doing as an agent of the Almighty, as his agent in this world flowing through your body, is to reach deeply into the sanctity that lies buried in the world, in the physical world, in things all around us, and you elevate them and you show that this too is part of God's world. You can take a piece of wood, a tree, you can chop it down, and you can turn it into an idol. You can take the same tree and chop it down and produce a beautiful table that becomes your Shabbat table, around which sanctity, song, celebration, and life and family are invited. You have taken this piece of wood and you've extracted the godliness from it, and you've elevated it to fulfill its purpose in this universe. And so it is with every object that there is in the world. We become, through the Kedusha that is invested in us, we become the chariots, the agents of God's will to be able to elevate his world, to bring out in every situation of human affairs, of thought and of idea and of deed, and in the things which we touch, the things with which we come into contact, our little part in the world that is given to us in our lives, that becomes our domain to turn into a space of holiness and of sanctity. And with every object which we touch, everything we come into contact with, everything that we deal with, we are fulfilling its purpose within creation, bringing out its inner, deep, profound sanctity, the godliness that lies buried within it. And in that respect, a person, as Lozata has said, that you, the physical objects of which he makes use become more elevated because of his having used it. You take the cup, the kos, the silver kos with wine at you, and you sanctify it with kiddush, and you have brought this piece of silver and this wine to its divine fulfillment. That's what it means to be a holy person. It's a big idea, but it is predicated upon the fact that in this prayer here, Ata Kadosh V'Shimcha Kadosh, we reach out to our Kadosh Baruch Hu and we say, the Kedusha, the holiness, this sublime holiness, transcendent holiness, which is so much beyond us, we want to draw that down into ourselves, into our own lives. We want to become Kadoshim, we want to become holy people, instruments of your will in this world. And in that regard, once again, this prayer becomes not an abstract prayer, but one in which we identify and associate with a huge, powerful, beautiful ideal of holiness in the world that sets us up for the day. This is where I want to spend my efforts and my energies in this day of God-given energy to me. That is what I want to achieve today before I go to sleep tonight. I want to draw down into the world another dimension of holiness, and it can only happen when I myself become an instrument of that holiness. I become kadosh in myself. So that is the idea of Luzata in this prayer. And on the next occasion, we'll take a look at a very different idea from Rav Kook. Please God, on Sunday. Amen. Well, just to come back to the idea of God and God's name. Ata Kadosh v'Shimcha Kadosh, and I explained that Shimcha means the dimension of God as he's revealed to us in the world, just as a name is only required in regard to an other. If you're just there for yourself, you need no name. So one of our group emailed me afterwards and said he'd always thought that the name, when we speak about God's name, we're talking about God's reputation. Name is reputation. So for example, we'll very often say, have in our prayers, Lema'an Shemo, for his name's sake, which means that we want to do something that is going to elevate his name or bring sanctity to his name or bring good reputation to his name. Similarly, when you talk about a person who does a Kiddush Hashem, a person who sanctifies God's name, we are sanctifying, in effect, people's perceptions of God, his reputation. So how does that square with the explanation that I gave? And the answer is, it is one and the same. Because when we talk about God's reputation, and we're talking about his image as we understand it. In other words, that dimension of God that is in connection with human perception, with the world, the part of God that is shown to the world. So it's that part which is reputational. The essence of God is completely beyond us. Let's now finally, after I've been promising for such a long time, come back to Rav Kook's concept of holiness. And he starts with I'll put it in slightly different terms, the way in which he puts it in order to make his point. Imagine a person, a man or woman, who decides that they are going to devote their lives to personal perfection. We have this sense that I want to be the most perfect human being. I want to be able to reach the apex of what I can achieve as a human being. And they're set about striving to become absolutely perfect. They spend their days in prayer and in fasting. They flagellate themselves if necessary. They roll around in the snow if that's the kind of thing that you like to do. They go to the mikveh 25 times a day. They daven 150 Amidahs every day. You can't talk to them. They are completely, totally taken up. Don't talk to me now. I'm perfecting myself. I am on a journey of human perfection. I'm going to reach the apex of what a human being can reach. I am going to be holy. Says Rav Kook, bad luck, mate. You're not going to get there. There will not be a shred of holiness in you. And the reason is because you are on a selfish journey. This is all about your own ego. This is actually all about me. It's about what I can attain to become a holy human being. So this is it's directed towards perfecting himself, his own needs. In other words, it's personal self-love. Kedusha requires a person to go completely beyond themselves, to act not for themselves, but in order to perform God's will in the world. I am not here. I am just an instrument. I am here to perform God's will. Aseret sono, perform his will. And the sense of self becomes completely negated. It's not important what I feel for myself. I'm not on a personal quest. I'm here because there's a bigger concept in the world, and there is a purpose and a function in this world, and I have been given the opportunity as a human being to be able to be a part of fulfilling the divine will in this universe. Following on from this, he therefore says that because a person is working towards the totality of mankind, the totality of humankind, working for something which is bigger than oneself, you can't do it by oneself. It can only be done together with others, because it is a collaborative engagement. Each one of us is just a little small part of the totality. So there has to be a sense in the person that I'm working together with others. I'm just a small little cog in the wheel of the universe. And that's the reason why he says the concept for Judaism is that Kedusha, holiness, can only dwell in a group of people. In other words, the concept of Akol Asare Shchinta Sharia. You need 10 people, 10 souls that come together, 10 little fragments of God in this world that join together in an enterprise before the presence of God can be revealed in some kind of manifest or tangible way. That's the concept of course, of minyan, So he sees the idea of holiness and minyan, of the collective, as one and the same, because it is not a personal endeavor, because it's not about a person standing at home, and davening on their own and reaching their own perfection. You will never do it on that basis. It's only when you are part of this bigger picture and when you become insignificant in the story. So it's an entirely different concept of holiness, and a very original one. And of course, Rav Kook was a mystic, a great Kabbalist, and this idea of the Shekhinah coming in the collective, being present where there is a group of people, that souls have to connect to my little fragment of soul, which is part of God, and your little fragment of soul, which is part of the same God, and the other person, that when they come together and they engage in something, there is a connectedness, that the souls becoming the spiritual connects together, and it creates a sense of the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because you've reached a critical mass. And without that critical mass, the level of revelation that allows you to say Kadosh, 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 or to say the repetition of the Amidah or Baruch Hu, etc., is simply not present, because the divine presence is not there in sufficient quantity or size or intensity or whatever, and it only comes through the collective. Well, with that, we conclude the third blessing, and we're ready pretty much to start the fourth blessing. And just by way of introduction, the Amidah, all the Amidahs, as for many of you might know, is really the concept of a sandwich. The two pieces of bread on either side are the first three blessings and the last three blessings, and they never change. The bread is always the same bread on either side of the sandwich. What changes is the filling in the middle, and it changes quite dramatically, because in our weekday Amidah, which of course has the 19 blessings, the 13 middle blessings are all blessings of personal request, personal and national request. Whereas on Shabbat, there is no personal request at all, there's only praise of Hashem. And so too with other every Yom Tov. So on Shabbat, the middle part of the sandwich is going to be about Shabbat. On Rosh Chodesh, it's going to be about Rosh Chodesh. On Rosh Hashanah, it's going to be about the themes of Rosh Hashanah. On Yom Kippur, it's going to be about atonement, etc. The middle part is going to change, but in the weekday Amidah, uniquely, it is actually about our requests. And there's an interesting little game that I've played with students sometimes in the past. I've said, can you put down on a piece of paper everything that you want in your life? Everything that's important to you as a Jew, both your own wishes and what you wish for the Jewish people. And then let's see if anything that you've written is omitted from these genius blessings in the middle of the Amidah. And most times you'll discover that it's very hard to find anything that is omitted from your wishes. In one form or another, everything that we hope for in our lives on a daily basis is going to be present in these blessings. And the first one, the fourth blessing of the Amidah, the first part of the inside of the sandwich, is the part that we're going to start looking at tomorrow.